Good morning, everyone, and welcome. Today, we're diving into the fascinating world of ethical philosophy with a focus on act versus rule non-consequentialism. We'll explore how these theories shape our understanding of moral reasoning and decision-making. I'm excited to guide you through this analysis and uncover the nuances that distinguish these important ethical approaches. Let's get started. Here, we explore non-consequentialist ethics, which is a way of judging morality differently from approaches that focus solely on outcomes. Instead of looking at the results of an action, these theories emphasize the importance of duties, intentions, or adherence to certain rules. Within this framework, there are two primary types: act-based and rule-based non-consequentialism. Act-based approaches evaluate each individual action on its own merits, while rule-based approaches consider whether the action aligns with a set of moral rules or principles. This perspective helps us understand morality as something grounded in principles and intentions, rather than just consequences. Here we're exploring the core principles of act non-consequentialism. This ethical approach evaluates each action on its own moral merits, emphasizing the intentions behind the act and the duties involved, rather than simply following general rules. It's a perspective that pays close attention to the unique context of each individual action, making moral judgments sensitive to the specific circumstances. The image of the shoes at a crossroads, labeled sloth and vitality, symbolizes the choices we face and the importance of considering each decision carefully, based on its own moral standing. Here we're exploring the concept of rule non-consequentialism. First, let's define it. This approach holds that the rightness or wrongness of an action is determined by whether it follows moral rules, not by the specific outcomes it produces. Moving on, these actions are evaluated based on their conformity to broad established moral norms, rather than on individual situations. Finally, an important point to highlight is that the justification for these moral rules doesn't depend on particular consequences. In other words, the rules stand on their own moral grounds, regardless of the results they bring about. This framework helps us understand how some ethical systems prioritize consistency and principles over outcomes. Here we have the key differences between act and rule non-consequentialism, illustrated clearly to help us understand their distinct approaches. Starting with act non-consequentialism, this perspective emphasizes flexibility. It allows decision-making on a case-by-case basis, taking into account the specific context of each situation. This means that exceptions are accepted, which can sometimes lead to inconsistencies in moral judgments. The balance scale icon here symbolizes this weighing of individual circumstances. In contrast, rule non-consequentialism values stability and predictability by strictly adhering to established rules. It minimizes exceptions to maintain consistent and rigid decision-making. The gavel icon represents this commitment to rules and order. Together, these two approaches highlight the tension between flexibility and consistency in ethical decision-making. Symbolized by the balance scale image here, reflecting the challenge of finding the right balance when making moral choices. Now let's look at some key strengths of act non-consequentialism. First, it emphasizes context sensitivity. This means it evaluates each moral situation based on its unique details, rather than applying a one-size-fits-all rule. Next, it focuses heavily on intentions. The moral worth of an action is judged by the intentions behind it, highlighting how important moral motives are in this framework. Finally, it provides case-specific moral clarity by concentrating on the morality of individual acts themselves. This approach offers clear guidance tailored to each specific case, allowing for nuanced ethical decisions. Together, these strengths make act non-consequentialism a flexible and intention-centered moral theory. Now, let's look at some key limitations of act non-consequentialism. First, it can lead to inconsistency across similar cases. Because each situation is judged independently, you might find contradictory moral judgments even in very comparable circumstances, which challenges the overall coherence of the ethical framework. Second, there's unpredictability for moral agents. Since evaluations are made on a case-by-case basis, It becomes difficult for individuals to anticipate moral outcomes, which complicates decision-making. Lastly, this approach offers limited guidance for rule-following societies. It struggles to establish general moral rules, making it challenging to build community-wide ethical frameworks that everyone can follow consistently. These points highlight some critical challenges we need to consider. Here, we're looking at the strengths of rule non-consequentialism, which really hinges on three main ideas. First, stability and consistency. This theory promotes steady, reliable principles that we apply uniformly across different situations, giving us a solid foundation to work from. Next, social cohesion. By encouraging coordination within communities, it supports more organized and harmonious interactions, which is crucial for maintaining order. Finally, clear guidance. Rule non-consequentialism provides straightforward rules that clarify what behavior is expected in various contexts, making it easier to navigate ethical decisions. Together, these strengths highlight why this approach can be so effective in guiding moral behavior. Here we explore some important limitations of rule non-consequentialism. First, rigidity can be a significant issue. Strictly following moral rules without exception might overlook complex situations where some flexibility is needed. Next, there's the problem of conflict with intuition. Sometimes moral rules can clash with our strong intuitive judgments about what feels right in specific cases, which can create tension. Lastly, the problem of exceptions arises when allowing any exception starts to undermine the authority and clarity of these moral rules, weakening their overall effectiveness. The image of the rusty padlock here symbolizes how strict rules can become outdated or difficult to apply when circumstances change. Here we have three practical examples illustrating act non-consequentialism in real-life situations. First, the doctor's lie to prevent panic. Here, the doctor intentionally lies to protect the patient, believing that the intention behind the lie, a moral duty to prevent harm, justifies the action, even if the outcome might not be ideal. Next, we see the bystander breaking a window. Although breaking the window is typically wrong, in this case, the immediate duty to rescue a child outweighs concerns about property damage. The action is judged based on the urgent moral obligation rather than the usual rule. Finally, the friend hiding someone from an unjust arrest prioritizes moral duty over legal norms. In an urgent context, the friend's choice to protect the person reflects a higher ethical responsibility, regardless of the law. Each example highlights how act non-consequentialism focuses on the moral duties and intentions behind actions rather than just their outcomes. Here, we have three practical examples that illustrate rule non-consequentialism in everyday situations. First, we see journalist confidentiality. A journalist sticks to the rule of protecting their source's identity, even if it might bring consequences. This highlights the importance of upholding principles regardless of the immediate fallout. Next, there's law enforcement consistency. A traffic officer enforces speed limits not just to catch offenders, but to maintain a predictable system where everyone knows and follows the rules. This consistency supports social order. Finally, judicial precedent shows a judge applying established legal rules consistently, even when personal feelings might suggest a different decision. This commitment to rule following ensures fairness and reliability in the legal system. Together, these examples show how sticking to rules, rather than focusing only on outcomes, guides important social functions. Here we see a comparison between act non-consequentialism and rule non-consequentialism, focusing on two key qualities, flexibility and consistency. Looking at the horizontal bars, act non-consequentialism scores very high on flexibility, which means it allows for more situational judgment and adaptability in ethical decision-making. However, its consistency score is relatively low, indicating that decisions may vary considerably depending on the circumstances. On the other hand, rule non-consequentialism scores high on consistency, reflecting a stronger adherence to established rules that guide actions uniformly across cases. This approach sacrifices some flexibility, as indicated by its lower score in that area, because it prioritizes following moral rules rather than adapting to each unique situation. This trade-off between flexibility and consistency is central to understanding how these two versions of non-consequentialism operate and influence ethical reasoning. It highlights the balance between adapting to particular cases and maintaining steady moral principles. Here, we're exploring the role moral rules play in how we make decisions. First, moral rules act as justifications. They give us the foundational reasons to support our actions, especially within rule-based, non-consequentialist ethics. Next, these rules function as decision procedures. That means they offer structured guidelines that help us navigate moral choices consistently across similar situations. Finally, even in approaches that focus on individual acts, moral rules serve as heuristics or practical shortcuts that guide us toward better decisions. Altogether, this shows how moral rules help shape and inform the way we approach ethical decision-making. Here we explore how different moral theories support our ability to reason ethically. First, moral sensitivity allows us to recognize the important moral aspects present in any situation, giving us clearer ethical awareness. Contextual judgment emphasizes the need to consider the specifics of each circumstance, ensuring that decisions are appropriate and respectful of those unique details. Intentional focus directs our attention to the intentions behind actions, which helps us evaluate their moral worth more deeply than just looking at outcomes. Consistency and predictability come from applying stable principles, which supports reliable and coherent ethical reasoning across various scenarios. Social coordination highlights how shared rules foster cooperation and mutual understanding within communities, which is essential for functioning societies. Lastly, simplified decision rules provide clear guidelines that reduce complexity and make moral decision-making more efficient. Together, these elements form a comprehensive framework for sound and practical moral reasoning. Let's review the key takeaways to wrap things up. First, the main concepts we discussed differ clearly in their definitions and focus areas, which is important to understand their foundation. Next, each approach comes with its own set of strengths and weaknesses, or trade-offs, that we need to keep in mind when making decisions. Moving on, these distinctions provide practical guidance, helping us apply moral principles effectively in real situations. Finally, by combining these perspectives, we gain complementary value, leading to a more comprehensive understanding and better coordination overall. These points together offer a solid framework for thinking through complex issues.